right. So for Lab 9, this was actually slides that Jared put together, but I'll be presenting them. So we're talking about constraints now. And what are constraints? Well, constraints are what we use in Rosetta to supplement the score function. So we have a bunch of score terms in Rosetta, and they cover a number of different things, but they don't always cover everything we want to do to function with the score function. For example, there might be experimental data that you want to incorporate when you're scoring, or some sort of knowledge that you want to impose on the score function landscape that isn't covered by any of these existing score terms. And you can use constraints to change the score function in very particular ways to make the energy landscape look more like what you would want it to look like. And in fact, if you do use constraints to change the energy landscape to incorporate things like experimental data, you can vastly reduce the search space when you're doing your modeling, and therefore much more easily come to correct answers than if you did an unrestricted search on just the regular Rosetta energy landscape. So used for scoring some property of a pose that's not being evaluated by a score function, and usually this is some sort of conformational property, angles, distances, etc. But the constraint system in Rosetta is very flexible, so it doesn't have to be this geometric properties. You can have other sorts of things like residue types. So you can constrain on residue types and say, I prefer this residue type at this position, and have an energy bonus for that. And as I mentioned, incorporating experimental data into simulation can greatly help reduce your search space and make it much easier to find good results than an unrestricted search does. I guess I should point out at this moment, for those people who have like an MD background or are coming from other places in molecular modeling, that Rosetta has a slightly idiosyncratic use of the term constraints. So people who are familiar with the MD terminology will know that there is a distinction between constraints and restraints, where constraints are actual limitations on your sampling space. So for constraints mean you'll never sample a particular degree of freedom, whereas restraints in the molecular dynamics sense means that you'll bias the energy function for a particular thing. In Rosetta, we use the term constraints to mean a bias to the energy function, whereas someone who's more familiar with an MD terminology might more consider that to be properly called a restraint. Just a little idiosyncratic use in the Rosetta, so just something to be aware of. All right, so in constraints in Rosetta, for flexibility's sake, we actually break constraints down into two separate portions. So there's the constraint type, which is the geometric or other property of the pose that you're actually constraining. So this is the distance between two atoms. And on top of that, we put the constraint function, which is how you're constraining it. So how do you convert that distance between two atoms into an energy term? And so these two separate portions of the constraints are represented in two different classes. So the constraint type is a core scoring constraints constraint class, and then how you actually convert that measurement into an actual energy value is implemented by a constraint func, which is in core scoring constraints func. All right. So there's many different types of constraints, the metrics, the constraint types. Some of the more common ones are angles, dihedrals, and atom pairs. These constraints geometric things like angles, dihedrals, and distances. And again, the flexibility, these don't necessarily have to be chemically connected angles, dihedrals, and atom and distances. These can be between, distances, angles, dihedrals, etc., between any set of atoms as well. So you can do through space distances or through space angles and constrain that way. And again, also mentioned residue type constraints, where you can at a particular position for when you're doing design, you can say, I want to favor these particular types of residues. You can also combine constraints and make more complex constraints. So we have in what we call a multi-constraint, which is like a mover that takes other movers. This is a constraint that takes other constraints. So one of the more useful ones is an ambiguous constraint, which takes a number of different subconstraints and then figures out which is the lowest energy constraint. And then the entire ambiguous constraint will evaluate to the energy of only the lowest energy constraint. For example, what you can use this for is, say you know that one atom needs to, a particular atom needs to be next to, say, a carboxylate group, but you don't know which carboxylate group on your protein it needs to be close to. What you can do is you can set up an ambiguous constraint between that one atom and then have distance constraints to all of the carboxylate groups in the protein. And then in the ambiguous constraint would then evaluate all the distances to all the ones, find the ones that is best, that's closest, that's lowest energy, and you only count that particular distance. So you evaluate the distance to the closest one and you ignore all the rest of them. Although if you move it around, you can switch between the ones. So those are the constraint types. Now there's also different constraint functions. And as I said, this is how you convert your metric that you measure with a constraint type into an energy. For example, here, one of the more common ones is a harmonic function, which is simply a parabola. And you can set a particular distance, a center point and a width of this function. And then you can say, as I deviate from the ideal width, I want to get increasing energy. So I will bias, when I do like minimization or packing, I should bias it towards the center point, draw things towards the distance or the angle dihedral, etc., that I want it to actually be. And there's a pretty good documentation of the different constraint types and the different functional types on the documentation wiki. So if you're interested in using constraints, I definitely encourage you to visit that page and see. So in Rosetta implementation, these different constraints are stored in a constraint set as owning pointers, as constant owning pointers, and they're added with the add constraint function. The constraint set is then stored as a member of the pose. So each pose has its own set of constraints. You can attach an arbitrary constraint set to a pose using the constraint set function. And you can actually additionally add single constraints with the add constraint function as well. One of the things to be aware of in adding constraints is the fact that the pose will actually copy the constraint. So this is, we talked earlier about deep copying semantics. This is an instance where the pose will want to have a deep copy of the constraint set. It has its own constraints. So you can be sure that the constraints won't be modified out underneath the pose, and the pose knows exactly where the constraint modifications are coming from. And this is important in several locations in Rosetta where we need to be sure that the constraints aren't changing, because when the constraints change, the energies change. And the pose needs to know that when the energies of its stored energies objects changes, so it can do smart updates and have consistent energy calculations. We also have a pose observer. I think this was talked about briefly before, but the constraint set attaches itself to the pose as a pose observer, and specifically it's looking for length event changes. So each constraint knows about which residues it's constraining, and it identifies those residues via their position in the pose. So what happens when you add or remove residues from the pose? Well, if you had a constraint that was constraining, say, residue 100, and you added 10 residues at position 50, residue 100 is no longer the same residue as it was previously. That residue is now moved to 110. So what happens is on a length event, when you add residues to the pose, a length event gets triggered. The constraint set then responds to this length event and says, hey, you have to renumber yourself. You're no longer residue 100, you're now constraining residue 110. And this way the constraints are consistent and point to the same residues throughout the change of the pose. And within the constraint set, there's also additionally a separation between the different types of constraints as far as how many residues they act upon. So you have residues that act on, you have constraints that act on a single residue, you have constraints that act between two residues, and then you have constraints that act on three different residues. And when you're doing scoring, it's important to know how these separate out. So you can sort of say, a constraint that acts on a single residue would be equivalent to a one-body energy, whereas a residue pair is a two-body energy, or a multi-body or a whole pose type energy. And you can separate out that dependency, so when you do things like packing, you know how to correctly incorporate the energy from the constraints into the total energy calculations. So you can get a constraint set owning pointer from the constraint in case you want to see what types of, from the pose to see what sort of constraints are in a particular pose. And you can also remove a constraint from a pose. And there's a number of different functions to remove that. And there's a distinction between object identity and value identity. And if you set compare equals to true, you'll look at object comparison, so value identity. So you're not looking specifically at, is this constraint object the same, an identical constraint object, but instead, does it have the same value? And that's useful, again, because of the deep copy semantics. So when you put a constraint into a pose, it's going to be copied, so it's not necessarily the identical constraint object, but you would compare it by the value of the constraint to see, is it constraining the same thing? Yeah, and it's necessary for removal in the pose because of course you're doing that cloning. All right. So the different constraint types. We should talk about constraints add to the score function, and they add it depending on what type of thing that they're constraining. They add it to a different energy term. So we have a number of different constraint terms in the Rosetta energy function. Here are some of the more common ones, coordinate constraint, atom pair, angle, dihedral, residue type. And so each constraint type has its own constraint term that it will add its energy to. And these need to be non-zero weighted in your score function in order for the constraints to be active. If you have something like just a plain Talaris 2013 score function, it does not have any of these constraint terms turned on. So even if you add your constraint to the pose, you won't actually be evaluating that during your simulation runs because the weights on each of these constraint terms would be turned off. So if you are adding constraints to your pose, you also have to remember to turn on the corresponding weight in the score function so that it's appropriately evaluated at the appropriate weight. And typically we set this to 1, although there's different protocols where you might want to change that value or ramp that value. And there's additional constraint-like score terms like the cart-bonded score term, which needs to be turned on during Cartesian minimization. So in the lab today, we're going to be working with constraints, and we're specifically going to be working with constraints to a metal ion. Some of this metal binding constraints has been added to Rosetta recently as an automatic setup. But for the purposes of this lab, we're going to be doing a manual setup of metal binding constraints. So the steps that we're going to take is we're going to be trying to determine what we're going to be constraining, so which residues, which atoms should be involved in the constraints. So create the functions that you're going to be using. So how are you going to be converting the distance measurements, the angle measurements, whatever, into an energy term, create the constraints between the various metrics that you want to have, apply the constraint to the pose, and evaluate the constraints. And remember, when you're evaluating the constraints, you have to turn on the appropriate term in the score function. All right. So step one, deciding what you're constraining. We're going to be constrained at the atom level, and specifically we're going to be looking at for a single zinc coordinating histidine. So a zinc and a histidine, and there's an interaction between the two. By default, this interaction isn't measured very well by the existing Rosetta score terms, so we're going to be adding a constraint to enforce this interaction to make sure that this geometry that happens in nature is preserved when we do the simulations. So we also need to create a function that represents this interaction. How are we going to convert the metric of distance, for example, into an energy term? And you should think about what function you should use to do that constraining and what parameters you should be set to. What's the ideal distance? How tight should the constraint be? How much variation should you allow? And there's two main functions in the code for the Func class. The first is just the Func method, which takes in a real value, which this is the actual metric that's being calculated by the constraint. And then it returns a value. So this is the transformed value. This is the energy value, or the unweighted energy value, I should say, for this particular metric. Also, for minimization purposes, you have dfunc, which is the slope, the derivative of this functional class, the derivative of the function at position, specifically for that position x. And here's an example for the harmonic function with this functional form. In the actual evaluation, we calculate just the straight value. Then for the dfunc, we actually compute the derivative of this based on x, and then that is the value that we're returning. So when computing the constraints, so actually calculating the metrics, one of the things we use to make this calculation versatile is something called an XYZFunc. And this XYZFunc is a special type of object or a map. And what it does is it converts an atom ID, and the atom ID is just basically a residue and atom index sort of combined together in a single object. And it takes this atom ID object and it converts it to a numeric XYZ vector, or basically the atom coordinates of for that particular atom. So because we have this generalized interface, we can write the score. This is the score function for the actual constraint object. So it takes in this XYZFunc, which will do the transformation. It also takes the map of weights and also the energy map, which is going to be adding its energies to. And so here is basically how this score function works. So we have atom 1 and atom 2, and these are just parameters that are being set as private member variables. So these are the two atoms that we're constraining the distance between. We pass those atom IDs, so these are atom IDs, we pass it through the XYZFunc to get out the vector of those atom positions. We can compute the distance between the two, and this distance is the metric that we then pass to the Func object, which will convert that distance into a score term, and this is the score value. And then we add that score value as an unweighted value to the energy map for the particular score type for this distance constraint. Question or? No? Okay. All right. So creating the Func. So the distances in angstroms, angular constraints are set in radians. And specifically for here, we'll be using the commonly used harmonic function. And again, this takes the ideal distance, which is is basically the center of the parabola, and then also the standard deviation, which is the width of the parabola as well. And again, and then once you create the constraint, you would add it to the pose. Let's see. Oh yeah, and atom pair constraint because we're constraining distances. Oops. All right. So yeah, create an atom pair constraint with a particular func, and then you can add it to the pose. Right. And as I mentioned before, and sort of I'm repeating this over and over again because it's something that's very commonly forgotten, and you sort of run your protocols and then you just are really curious as far as why aren't they working. Yeah, if you add constraints, you have to remember to turn the constraint weight for that particular constraint on. Otherwise, things don't work because most of them default to 0 in a lot of energy functions. So if you add a constraint to your pose, you have to make sure that you're using it with the appropriate constraint weight turned on in your score function. And so an example of how to add that into your score function. So it's very useful to be able to add constraints flexibly to protocols and not have to make them recompile every time you want to change the constraints. And for this reason, we have constraint files in Rosetta. And so a constraint file basically is a textual representation of how you can set up a constraint set. So it's more or less a line-based format, and it's broken down exactly like the separation of concerns. So you have your definition of your constraint type at the beginning of the line, and then you have your actual function definition at the second half of the line. For example, here we're making an atom pair constraint. We're constraining the C alpha atom of residue 5 and the C alpha atom of residue 2, so 32, so the distance between these two. And we're using the harmonic function as the functional form. And then you have both the ideal distance and the standard deviation, so how the spread of that parabola. And again, this is well documented on the documentation wiki as far as how you set up the constraint files. And it's a line-based format, so you can add in your constraint file, you can have multiple constraints, each on one line. So in your actual protocol, how do you read something that's been specified as a command line option if you want to give your users the ability to set their own constraint files? And so in the code, you can get the constraint IO object, and you can read the constraints from a particular file name. And there's a number of different command line parameters. Probably one that would be used often is constraint underscore FA underscore file. For these are full atom constraints, a constraint file for the full atom. And so here's some additional information. So in the code, there's a number of different files that you can look at and directories. So I mentioned that Teleris 2013 by default does not have any constraints turns on. So as a convenience, in the weights directory, we also have a file, Teleris 2013 underscore constraints, which is Teleris 2013, but also turns on the weights file. There's also a number of different options for specifying constraints file and weights. You can actually specify specifically, a full atom constraint file versus a centroid constraint file because the atoms in the two different residue types are slightly different. And there's also various options depending on your protocols for automatically setting up constraints to various things.